Here lies my dog ate my book report. They were not obedient. A podcast where two weirdo 30 somethings take turns introducing each other to a formative book from childhood the other has never read. I'm Wren, they, them, and I am the one subjecting everyone to this book this time.
And I'm Brandon, he, him, and I'm mourning. This is apparently our final episode. Podcast is dead and buried.
It was thematic,
Death
Brandon.
is the end, as we know. There is nothing after that.
That is not accurate, according to Stephen King.
Yeah.
So, yes, today we will be discussing Pet Cemetery by Stephen King, which is quite obviously a me pick. And also, this is, I think, one of the first, this is definitely not for children books. Don't let your kid read this, even though I read it when I was 9. I feel like everything else so far has been, you could give this to a kid. This one, don't.
Yeah, I mean, even the stuff that we have read that wasn't technically written for children
Yeah.
didn't necessarily have a ton of stuff going on in it that would have been inappropriate or challenging.
Oh, good golly. Well,
At least not until robots are a consistent part of our culture and have like personhood and stuff, and then the robot trilogy might have some stuff in it that is frowned upon. But we're not there yet.
I'm gonna just like jump out of the gate before the book synopsis with the content warnings for this book
Yeah, it's probably the best.
because there's a lot. There's a number of sex scenes that get fairly graphic. There's a lot of talk of death. It's, inherent in the entire theme. There's death scenes, there's a fair amount of gore. There is animal death, there is child death, there's infidelity, there's problematic white guy depictions of Native American mysticism. This is probably not an exhaustive list, but there's a start. So
Passing mention of other racial stereotypes.
So Lewis Creed, the protagonist, sorta, he's a doctor. He has just moved his family to Maine because he got a job at the University of Maine as their resident doctor. They're from Chicago. I don't know if it's like really super relevant. I don't know much about Chicago, so but everything gets pretty grim pretty quickly. Their cat gets run over by trucks on the road.
Just one truck.
Just one
Only
truck.
one truck ran over
It's
the cat, I think.
I
Yes.
yeah, and it actually never even said it was a truck necessarily. It could have
I mean,
been a car.
obviously, it was definitely a truck. The implications of truck.
Yeah, it's hard to synopsize this book. His friendly, good old boy across the street neighbor Judd brings him to the pet cemetery up the hill, and then beyond the pet cemetery up the hill, where there is a Native American burial ground, which got tainted somehow. It's a little nebulous. They bury the cat comes back to life, but the cat comes back weird. And then other people die, like humans. And there is some debate about whether or not it's a good idea to bury them. Suffice to say, our protagonist goes, quite frankly, insane and does that, and then there's more death, and everything's terrible. That's my synopsis of this book.
Yeah, like there's actually not a lot of things happen in it, but it is still long
It is quite long.
because yeah, it's really just they move to a new place. Uh, the cat dies. Lewis's daughter's sad because it's her cat. The new neighbor is like, "Hey, you're in luck. You happen to move adjacent to a magical pet cemetery where things come back if you bury them there." And we're for the cat, and then other tragedy is fixed via the cemetery as well, but it goes wrong because that is better.
Right.
Yep. Just zombies are never a good idea.
There is mention of the force that is behind why all of this stuff goes wrong, is something that I know that we as white people are not allowed to say. Um, it is a W word
Oh, wait, really?
in yeah. Like if you like you it's I've read that you aren't really even allowed to say the word because saying it is like incredibly bad. Can summon it or is
Ah,
bad luck. Like multiple interpretations of it, but the general consensus I've seen online is that you're not even supposed to say it. It is said a lot in the book.
yeah, I've never heard that it was problematic, to say, 'cause it's used in a lot of fiction, which granted,
yeah, it's
that itself is appropriation, and it's usually not very accurate.
yeah. So this thing, which is often used as like a cryptid type thing, is something that is very prevalent in certain native spiritual practices and such. It, it is given as probably the reason why the soil is tainted in this pet cemetery and why things come back wrong.
Yeah, which, I know I looked this up at the time because the depiction of this entity in this novel is different than what I'm used to from other things that have been based upon it, and so I wasn't really sure. I was like, are any of these even close to the actual folklore and stuff? And the answer is no.
Yeah, my most recent interaction with this thing is in Fallout 76. It's a very prevalent monster that you fight all over the place in that
Yeah.
game. So,
Yeah, and it's become there's a lot of like horror stuff, both film and TV, that has a version of this, and then like there's a Marvel Comics character named after this.
oh, wow.
But apparently, Stephen King's interpretation is most likely derived, from some earlier fiction, again by I think white people, possibly August Derleth, The Thing That Walked on the Wind.
Mm,
Anyway, all that to say, usually the book is just talking about sort of the force of the cemetery, like the cemetery itself is an entity, or that may or may not be one with this creature.
yeah, it was. The big parts that involved it were definitely at the point where Lewis was completely has completely just lost it, and
Hmm.
so he thinks it's chasing him at some point, and et cetera, et cetera. So he's a highly unreliable narrator by that point. I mean, he becomes a pretty unreliable narrator really fairly early, but still, it's
Yeah.
okay. um, Before I get into the reasoning of like, why did I read this when I was 9? I did want to touch on the this is not the first time that Stephen King has used Native American mysticism to create some horror aspect to one of his books, or to have like, the good guy force be some mostly butchered Native American mythology sort of situation. It I'm not going to excuse him because he's definitely like talked about how maybe he shouldn't have done some of those things. I read this book because my parents were at my grandparents' house and they watched the movie. So this was probably around 1989, 1990. I don't have a good like wiggle room. I don't have a good like
Yeah.
grasp on exactly when this was.
The movie was what, 89?
Yeah, so this is probably 19 oh no. If this was, when it came out on VHS, so 1990, 1991, maybe. I was younger than 9. Wow, me. I have a problem. Anyway, they kicked me out of the room. And I always thought it was really rude to watch movies that the kids weren't allowed to watch in the only living room. So they would send me and my little brothers to this finished room in the basement, which is where, the kids' play space was. And I was just so mad. There were a lot of movies they wouldn't let me watch, but the really great thing about Stephen King was if they wouldn't let me watch the movies, I could go to the library because they didn't monitor what I read. They didn't care what I read.
Yeah.
They just saw me in a corner reading a book and they were like, "Yeah, reading is fundamental." So I'm like maybe 7, 8, 9, who knows, reading Pet Cemetery. I, of course, was, very engaged, partially probably because it was something I wasn't supposed to be taking in, and also just because horror is like, I don't know, even more magical and mysterious when you're a child. Um, I very quickly just started ingesting a lot of the Stephen King that was available. That was the start of my Stephen King obsession from the age of, I don't know, 8 to 16, maybe.
Mhm.
Yeah.
I, on the other hand, had never read a Stephen King novel prior to this.
Did you read On Writing?
Yeah, but that's not a novel. It's a nonfiction.
Oh, right.
And I had just, let's see. So this is probably where I confess to a little bit of a shame, a secret shame, not really all that secret shame. I was
Mhm.
I was just like really, really cowardly as a child. Horror, and the idea of horror movies and horror books freaked me out without me having to see any of them or read any of them. Um, I was even when I was young, despite being at like the exact correct age for the Goosebumps series when it started and when it was like as huge as it ever was going to be, and I had a lot of friends reading Goosebumps, I was too afraid to try any of them,
Oh, no.
which is ridiculous because they aren't scary. So, needless to say, I also was in no rush to read Stephen King uh, at any point in my life, really, because by the time I was like, "Oh no, horror! I actively like horror. It's kind of good." I would look at them and be like, "Those are too long."
One of the things that I found very true to Maine life was the roads. The town of Ludlow, where the book takes place, doesn't actually exist. It's a stand-in for any of the little small towns that are around Orono and Bangor, which is the area where the college is. That does actually exist. That the main character was the doctor for. Um, but I grew up in one of those small towns around Bangor, which mostly just consists of, a street that doesn't have a street name. It's just Route whatever. It's Route 5 in this book, I think. Mine growing up was 202 and 9. But anyway. Um, and the trucks were real. They would just barrel down these roads without a care for the fact that, there's kids biking, there's kids playing, they're all over the place. We lost countless cats to these trucks. And unfortunately, horribly, my childhood dog, I actually saw it get hit.
No.
I just happened to glance out the window at the right time. And I kind of still to this day get really angry at my parents for not keeping a better eye on my pets. But I didn't really know any better when I was a tiny child. That, you know, cats should not be outside.
Mhm.
So that definitely resonated with me. We did not have a magical cemetery to bury them in. I thought about that a lot while we were rereading it.
Yeah, I would imagine so. I have never really experienced like tragic pet death. All of my pets have just like lived to a relatively old age and died of natural causes.
Well, your parents are responsible pet owners.
Yeah, generally speaking, I suppose.
So I definitely had a lot of thoughts while I reread this. This is possibly one of the only Stephen King books that I read at a very young age that I've never reread.
Uh-huh.
I have a couple in my rotation that I reread periodically every couple of years. Like, I'll go back and reread it and The Stand and a number of other ones fairly regularly. But this one I just never reread, and I was trying to sort of think about why. And I think when I was a kid, I didn't see it as scary and interesting as some of the other ones. Maybe because the main character was not relatable to me as a tiny child, and the characters in it, they're all children, so they're much easier to sort of identify with when you're a child reading it. But I also think that maybe I didn't find death as upsetting when I was a tiny child because it was a way more abstract concept than now as an adult where, death is looming. Maybe that's why. I don't know. It just never occurred to me to go back and reread it. I also never went and spite watched the movie until last week,
Oh.
and the movie was not good.
I I caught the movie on TV at some point in high school, probably on the Sci-Fi Channel, and I watched it. And so I remembered a handful of like core elements to the story, but not much in particular, and not enough that I can really articulate like how well I think the movie did or did not adapt the book.
Yeah.
So as a whole, I actually mostly enjoyed the book, and I didn't feel like it felt like it was as long as it was. So my general distaste for longer books is because oftentimes I just kind of am ready to be done with a story after a certain point on average, and I was expecting that to be kind of a chore with this one, but it wasn't. I found it pretty readable, even though the contents sometimes I had like plot notes. But something that I wanted, and I know that this is like a fine line to walk with horror, but I kept waiting for there to be a little more of an explanation for things, and there's wasn't. And I know that you don't necessarily want to like get to the end of your horror story by telling everybody the exact mechanics of everything supernatural happening or whatever. But I felt like this book didn't get quite far enough because it feels like the book starts leaning on the notion that the cemetery, kind of manipulates people supernaturally somehow. And like that's why, for example, Judd even tells Lewis about the cemetery in the first place, is theoretically this notion that Judd kind of had to. But at a certain point, it just started to be like, oh, I feel like maybe this situation isn't being set up organically. The characters are just all acting very stupid in this situation, and there's not a good reason for it. So the cemetery did it, you know?
That's a good point. I feel like the town itself being sort of this entity that is manipulative in a way is a theme that he explores to much greater effect in it. And I actually didn't stop to see whether or not which one he wrote first. Oh, okay, yes. He wrote it after Pet Cemetery. So I'm not gonna like sit here and posit what Stephen King may have been thinking, but I feel like maybe he took that theme of this mysterious entity manipulating the entire town around it and just pulled on that way better for it.
Yeah. And like, I don't feel like that was really a thing. I don't think he was trying to use that as the core theme of the book here, certainly. So I understand that it wasn't something he was digging into as much as things like how we deal with death. But yeah, it just from a plot standpoint, I felt like I needed a little more of something to get me across the hurdle, especially in the climax, of why everybody was, it's that cliche about how characters in horror movies are just very stupid sometimes,
Mhm.
like just habitually, because that's the only way that they would end up in situations that they're vulnerable to the whatever. And I kind of felt that way with this book because it treats it like the cemetery is linked to some like primal force of the universe, right? Like
Mhm.
it's treated as a thing like, okay, the Micmacs knew that it did that and had some beliefs about it, but that, like, the Force is even older than that, right? Um,
Mhm.
and so it just can do things. And the things that it can do are make everybody not tell each other what they're going to do or what is happening in their brains or basic facts that might help them not die or meet some other kind of tragic end. And like,
I I find that sort of pacing uh, very interesting when I think about what I retained when I read it, because my impression going into this was that the book was going to start, they were going to set up a little bit, the cat was going to die pretty much immediately, and the book was going to make you think that the cat was the bad guy. But then very quickly, the kid was going to die, and they were going to go with all that. But in reality, the the pacing of the book was huge amount of setup. That guy dying in his office, the cat dies eventually, Judd story time, cemetery, cat action, cat's weird for like 100 pages, way too much detail about Rachel and Lewis's sex life. And then what, like the last 75 pages are the actual like meat of the problem?
yeah, I mean, it takes him like the penultimate 100 pages or so to decide that he's going to dig Gage up, and then also to dig Gage up. The the him in the graveyard, um, and like getting over the fence and stuff. It felt to me like that was literally 20% of the book, getting over that fence.
It it was a hard part to get through.
So the interesting thing, because I like I said, I had seen the movie ages and ages ago, and I remember the core plot points of cat dies, cat gets buried in the cemetery and resurrected, child dies, same thing, and then kills everybody. I remembered like those the core beats. And so, for one thing, because of the length of the book, I assumed that the movie was just one of those things that like cuts things out entirely in like large swaths as far as plot's concerned. And I think the only like substantive stuff the movie, as I recall, cuts out is like I don't feel like it really dealt much with people who had used the cemetery prior, because the book does give us a decent amount of background.
No, they do actually go
Mm,
into that for a bit. They tell it all wrong and weird in the movie.
mm. Yeah, so I'm just not remembering that
The
then.
major things that they cut out in the movie, uh, is just inner monologue,
Yeah, that's obviously
but that's so important.
yeah,
I don't think it translates well to a movie at all because you don't get to really understand why Lewis is doing the things he's doing
yeah,
at all. He just goes from like, "I'm stoic doctor man" to "I'm talking to myself and digging up my dead son," just with nothing to give you any amount of why.
yeah.
But speaking of why does the cat come back and the cat's just kind of clumsy and a little weird? But when people come back, they just want to murder people. I'm okay with horror things giving us very little explanation for stuff, but I did just want a little bit of explanation for that because they can talk, they can explain. The animal can't explain, but the humans could have explained.
Yeah, and like it's another thing that like characters intimate stuff. Like Judd tells Lewis early on that like you can kind of, if you do it with a pet, with an animal, the animal's going to come back a little off. But if you're willing to accept that and the smell, it's fine. But if you do it with a person, it's going to be bad. And I assumed that I sort of filled in the blanks of that situation with the assumption that something people have a more complex soul or some greater connection to the whatever that is behind everything, or like when people are brought back by the cemetery, they have that whole demon possessiony thing where they know secrets there would be no way for them to know about people,
Mm.
and stuff. So I think I kind of just when those ideas were presented and then not really filled in more by the book, I just sort of inserted demons. The book never goes into the whys of that. Much like it doesn't go into, how the cemetery compels people to do things like share knowledge of it. Like, this is something that I also noted. The dead guy, whose name I can't remember, the guy who dies early on.
Oh, Vincent Pascal.
Yeah, like you said, he dies fairly early and is like for a decent chunk of the beginning of the book, kind of the major plot point that happens because it affects Lewis because Lewis was trying to save him, but he was beyond saving and everything. And like, yeah, that's gonna stick with you, even if you're a doctor and probably have seen people die before.
Well, he seemed like he was a pretty fresh doctor.
Yeah,
And this kid, Vincent Pascal, on Lewis's very first day of work when he's touring the new offices, this kid comes in having been jogging with friends and had been hit by a car
yeah,
and just dies in Lewis's arms.
yeah. But he visits Lewis in a dream, right? And I think as the book progresses further, it seemed to me like the implication was meant to be that it was genuinely like his ghost or something. It wasn't just a random dream because he visits Ellie in her dreams later on.
Right.
But he does this thing where he's like in a dream shows Lewis the cemetery is back there and stuff, and I was like, wait a second. And he shows it to Lewis, but he says like, don't do anything with it, just don't. Bad idea. And I'm kind of like, if you hadn't visited Lewis in his dream, would any of this have happened? Like, I guess Judd would probably have told him about the cemetery, but I don't know. It felt to me at the time Pascal's attempt to warn Lewis not to do the thing is the thing that made Lewis think doing the thing was worthwhile to do.
Well, he says, Stephen King being, says right before the scene where Victor Pascal dies, this is where Lewis, when he thought back on it, realized the nightmare truly started.
Yeah, yeah, and I just kind of was like, why did this occur? Like, why this visitation? Because it and I think later on is still intimated that maybe the cemetery made this happen also. But yeah, it just sort of feels like it felt to me like the order of operations was Pascal dies. Pascal is so concerned to tell Lewis not to use the cemetery that he tells Lewis not to use the cemetery because if he did, something might happen that he'll think is good, but he shouldn't. And it sort of felt like telling a teenager not to do a thing that the teenager didn't realize wasn't allowed until you told them.
Yeah, don't look in that box in my closet, honey. Like,
Yeah.
oh, now I'm spoiled on my Christmas presents.
And so I was kind of like, I don't know if this is either the cemetery manipulating uh, either Pascal's like soul or just Lewis's dreams, right? But using reverse psychology. But if it's a cemetery, why would Pascal visit Ellie? I kind of felt like, yeah, like Pascal seemed to be operating somewhat benevolently later on because he starts visiting Ellie in her dreams.
Yeah, but he makes her go completely batshit, which is why I think one of the reasons why Rachel was so susceptible to rushing back, thinking there was something very, very wrong,
Oh, I see.
which led to Rachel's death. So I feel like book Pascal is bad. However, movie movie Pascal, they turn Pascal into Pascal the Friendly Ghost. He has a way bigger role. He's all throughout the book and he physically guides Rachel back to town, like finds her a flight, helps her hitchhike. Like it's ridiculous. He's just there the whole time.
I have no recollection of that. That sounds kind of fun.
It's bad. I was laughing so hard. So like in the movie he's like benevolently trying to help. It's so weird.
So I read his interactions with Ellie as having the side effect of making Ellie seem crazy and making Rachel concerned about Ellie, but that wasn't because of Pascal. That was because of Lewis gaslighting her, right?
Oh, that's fair,
Like,
yeah.
I read it like
Oh god, Lewis is so terrible.
Pascal tries to warn Lewis. Lewis does not listen. So Pascal tries to, you know, warn Ellie, or I guess more specifically, like get Ellie to warn Lewis, possibly hoping that, hey, if I communicate through his daughter, he won't be able to write me off as just some kind of hallucination of his dreaming mind, and maybe that way he will understand that he's on a very bad path that he should not follow, and
Mm,
but then like Lewis just kind of, I forget exactly how he responds to Ellie, but he's definitely not like, "Oh yeah, I met that ghost. What you dreamt was totally real." He's very just sort of like, "It was a dream, don't worry about it." And when Rachel gets a little suspicious, because as I recall, she remembered the name, Pascal's name enough from like Lewis telling her about how he had died and everything,
mhm.
that when Ellie is like slightly mispronouncing his name, it does trigger something. Like she recognizes that there's something there, but Lewis won't tell her either, right? Um,
Yeah.
yeah, Lewis is garbage, and I think we're supposed to think that, right? I don't think Stephen King was like under the impression he was writing a sympathetic protagonist,
No, I don't think so.
but he's garbage.
So, I have a couple I have just, like, a little side segue about asking you about your experience reading this for the first time that is more of a I wanna talk about Stephen King's writing style,
Okay,
uh, y asking you as an English major.
doesn't give me any special authority, but sure.
There's 2 things that, Stephen King does in this book that are very Stephen King stylistic, like, throughout many of the books that I've read of his. One of them is repeat phrases cutting in as intrusive thoughts constantly.
Uh huh.
And in this book, it's "Hey ho, let's go," "Oz the Great and Terrible," and "Smoky the Cat,"
Yeah.
that just like cut in all the time. And I always thought, especially in some other books where it's used to very great effect to really depict the character who's thinking them going really having some mental problems going on. Uh, I wanted to know what you thought about that because I haven't seen that in a lot of other things. Just how often he repeats these phrases.
Yeah. I mean, repetition is often a very powerful tool for emphasizing things or symbolizing things. You know, so like in this instance, for example, the "Hey ho, let's go" is usually the thing that pops up when Lewis is like going off the deep end, right? When he
Mhm,
knows he is doing something he shouldn't be doing on some level, and certainly this repetition, makes all the much more sense when the, the book is as fixated on the inner life of a particular character as this book is. It's not literally a first person narrative, but it is always tuned directly into Lewis's brain. So yeah, I thought that stuff was, for a recognizable reason that was identifiable and effective.
yeah, I mean, I like him. I like when Stephen King does that. I was just curious what you thought about it.
Yeah, no, that's
I
repetition is absolutely a thing.
It kind of makes them like these little like micro memes
Yeah.
in specific books.
Well, and they become shorthand for bigger ideas. Like Oz the Great and Terrible was or terrible. I have a hard time pronouncing terrible
I
without the
tried. I
R's.
tried in the outline to spell that. I
Yeah,
don't know
no,
if
I
you
I
saw.
I I remember that it was with W's, but my mouth doesn't want to say terrible.
My mouth didn't want to do it either.
But like that becomes the shorthand for the power of the cemetery, right?
Yeah.
So it's also just a way that like he can talk about the power of the cemetery without constantly being like the dark force behind the pet cemetery that manipulates people like a puppeteer every other sentence, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, that totally fine.
The other thing that he does a lot, which I usually really enjoy, is interruptions. So you mentioned already that it felt like the scene where he is in the graveyard trying to go dig up Gage. There are multiple sections where he just pauses the action, especially in parts where the action is really ramping up and you just kind of want to see what happens. And then he pauses it for some long tangent of a memory. And, like, in the graveyard, he goes on this tangent about when he remembered working for his, I want to say his uncle who ran a funeral home,
Right.
and these conversations that they had about the times of year that people die. He does this a lot in his books as he just cuts into the action with memories and stories. And I always really enjoy them because they're usually very interesting and usually have something to do with the theme and are generally like, if they're like a topic that is not necessarily Stephen King's purview, are pretty well researched. Like he talked with a number of morticians and doctors and things about funeral practices and stuff to research this book. So these little factoids about times of year that people die, I'm sure are correct. And even though it definitely like cuts into the action, it makes it, I think, a little bit more tense and interesting. But those are the intrusive thought repeat phrases and the interruptions with memories is something that Stephen King does a ton to add in more horror or more tension to his horror stories, and I just found that interesting.
Yeah, I think that the interruptions in scenes that are maybe more focused on action, sort of, were generally good ways to tune into how the character is feeling about the action going on,
Mhm.
which sometimes is, more important than the action itself, right? It is more interesting to know where Lewis's head is at when he's breaking into the graveyard to dig up Gage than it is to know precisely how he scaled the fence, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I generally didn't mind them. I also found uh, that part of the reason I think I didn't mind them. I don't think it was a. I don't think it's a problematic tool, but I found that the times when I was bored of the book were times when he was writing scenes of, I don't want to say action, but scenes where stuff was actually happening in the scenes. When he was actually talking about getting into the graveyard, for example, I mostly was pretty tuned out. I was like, just let him get over the fence. I do not care.
Even though I feel like there's so much I could say about Stephen King. We could have multiple Stephen King episodes, and I could fill up the entire time. But before we hop over to just talking about him a little bit, I just wanted to get a general sense of, like, do you think you would have enjoyed it if you read it as a kid? What are your general thoughts on this?
If I had somehow gotten over the fact that Slappy the Dummy was possibly the scariest thing in the world,
Sorry.
I don't think I would have enjoyed it very much, and I think that's because I don't think I would have enjoyed the amount of time spent on the mundane stuff that I just said I really liked.
That's fair.
Yeah, like I think I kind of alluded to this as well when we talked about Caves of Steel. That when I first read that book and its sequels, I didn't necessarily, as a kid, get super into some of the lengthy digressions about like sociology and stuff that I now find like interesting stuff to think about. And I kind of feel the same about this book. I think that if I had read it as a kid, I would have been sitting there for long periods just being like, when is he gonna bury the cat already? Just like bury the cat. And then I'd be mad if the cat didn't do anything except for kind of wander around and smell.
The thing that the extensive trip to the cemetery and how difficult it was to traverse the rocks and the little swampy area and stuff, the thing that it just made me think of every time was How the fuck is the 2-year-old gonna get back and know his way home?
Yeah.
I would have slept at the graveyard until the boy crawled out of the dirt and then helped carry him home because he's 2. But no, he's magical, scary, murder doll 2-year-old, so he found his way back apparently.
Yeah. I wasn't too weirded out by Gage getting back on his own, because at that point I was just like, the cemetery is just magic, and because he's a human, maybe he's possessed by a demon now or something. Because that's sort of the conclusion I had come to from the conversation about. I don't remember the name of this character either, but the one that
Timothy.
yeah, the Judd said like had been brought back many years
Mhm.
prior, and just kind of like wandered around, quoting The Exorcist at people.
And, like, telling everyone their secrets and stuff.
Yeah,
It's like, "Oh, yeah, you're cheating on you, you're cheating on you." Yeah, it is.
yeah. And like that stuff is like exactly like, for example, the kind of stuff that the demon says in The Exorcist. That sort of thing is a very commonly used way to sort of symbolize that, or to sort of guide what does a person possessed by a demon do, you know? So that's why I had that conclusion, and because by the end he had not disabused me of this notion because he had offered no alternative.
True. So I have a discussion question.
Uh-huh.
It took me a fair bit to figure out what the discussion question for this book could even be because everything I thought of was just incredibly morbid.
Yeah.
This is still morbid, but it is the most like PG morbid I could think of for this book. So, if you were a pet,
Mhm.
what would be written on your pet cemetery marker, a la Smucky the cat? He was obedient.
Hmm. Hmm.
Brandon the blah, blah 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 blah.
Yeah, that's it.
Yes,
um. Hmm. Do I have to decide what kind of pet I would be?
you don't, but you can for fun.
It should probably be a pun, but I'm not really sure what kind of pun. An easy pun, I imagine, because a child is probably making
Mm.
the grave marker. Probably something like Brandon the corn snake. Oh, comma, rats. Because I died because I was afraid of the rodents that they fed me,
Oh
which
no!
is a thing that I saw a corn snake kind of go through once.
Oh no!
Where just like the snake was just like huddled into a corner, and there was a mouse just kind of like hanging out, doing minding his own business, and the had been in there for a while.
Yeah, so Stephen King. I really like Stephen King. Did you read the foreword?
I might have, but I don't recall. I probably did.
Well, first off, how many books would you estimate Stephen King has written?
63.
You looked that up.
I did no such thing.
You looked it
I
up.
did not.
It's 64. Okay. Well, so in the forward for this book, he mentions the inspiration for it, which, as you might guess, is main roads being or main country roads being horribly terrifying with their trucks,
Hmm.
and also that when his daughter buried their cat Smucky, she wrote Smucky he was obedient, and his little note was Smucky wasn't in the least obedient. Of course, he was a cat. But so he wrote this book and he ended up putting it away for a long time because he wrote it and he said, "This is the scariest thing I've ever written. No one's going to want this." And he put it away. And it wasn't in this book's forward, but I think it was in the forward of another one. Like, I think maybe it was in the forward for Bag of Bones or something, where he mentions that he always has several books on deck to be published at any given time. He just front loads a bunch of books. So when publishers come asking for a new thing, he can just hand them something. And also it helps like if he front loads a bunch of stuff if he has periods of writer's block. But so this book ended up being in storage for a while until he needed to finish a contract with the publisher, and so he just handed them this, and they edited it, and it went out, and was very popular.
Yeah.
So I thought that was pretty interesting. Stephen King is an author who He's had a very long career. He started in the 70s, and he definitely has made many a goof in terms of representation and such. The aforementioned problematic depictions of Native American spirituality that is prevalent through many of his books as well. And he also definitely leans way too heavily on the trope of the magical black person in The Stand and Green Mile, stuff like that. But the one thing I really like about him is that he is not aged into a, say, William Shatner. He has aged into a flaming liberal. He's gone toe to toe with J.K. Rowling on Twitter. He is very politically active, and he's acknowledged a lot of the missteps in writings that he's done, which I really appreciate. I've read interviews and such where he's just like, "Yeah, I should not have written that, and I'm sorry." So I really like that about him. While this book was definitely not my favorite Stephen King book ever, it's definitely in my lower echelon of Stephen King books, honestly. But I just really like him as a person. And I wanted to give a little side note because I knew that you read On Writing. He wrote that he was recovering from being hit by a car while he was out walking.
Yeah, I know. He talks about that a bit in the book as well.
Oh, I didn't know.
Um,
'Cause I haven't read that one. Maybe I should.
yeah, I mean, I found it good. Um, he obviously is a whatever else you can say about Stephen King, and I have always found him when I've seen him or in like interviews or whatever. I've always found him to seem like he's a pretty decent dude. But whatever you can say about like his writing, love it or hate it, he is prolific.
Mm.
And that can be like output. Certainly for me, is arguably the hardest part of writing. I think certainly is for many people. So yeah, I mean he has some handy insights and anecdotes if you're curious how he does what he does. It's not a dry like instruction manual. There's a lot of personal anecdote and sort of getting at the way he thinks about writing and stuff, and certainly some of how maybe his outlook changed as a result of his real life, near brush with death because he was severely injured.
Yeah,
Um,
like
it was
definitely near death car accident.
yeah,
And also it really it kind of struck me that it mirrored Pascal
hmm
because Pascal was hit by a car when he was out just walking around.
yeah. Like I knew that this book was well before that accident had ever happened, but it did kind of strike me, no pun intended, I guess,
Oh no.
that this book in particular was like very anti-car in its way. Not like he was railing against the automobile industry or anything, but like cars, and cars in a general sense of any sort of motorized vehicle that drives on roads, don't look great in this book. Like they're always just attached to tragedy. They're arguably like more pernicious monsters than the possibly demon possessed zombie toddler that kills people with a scalpel. So yeah, I thought that was sort of, it almost made it seem like if they made a movie about Stephen King's life and then they were like, "Oh yeah, Pet Cemetery has all of these people who die by getting hit by cars or all of these important characters who die by being hit by cars and like it's really fixated on this road and how often the trucks just go barreling through there and it's dangerous." I'd be like, that foreshadowing for the actual events later in his life couldn't possibly be real. Some Hollywood writer thought up that because they thought it was cute.
Well, it's pretty interesting that, this man who is known for writing some of the scariest stuff of our time, when he actually got hurt and had to like convalesce and was writing something, he doesn't write something scary. He just writes a book about the writing process
Yeah,
because he already wrote stuff like about car accidents.
yeah.
He didn't need to revisit that. I also definitely want to take a second to like praise one of his non horror books. I think my favorite Stephen King book is Hearts in Atlantis, which isn't horror at all. I I may have you read that at some point.
I quite like that movie, so I am on board.
It's got a little bit of mystery, a little bit of like hints of potentially preternatural stuff, but
Yeah.
no outright monsters or anything.
Yeah. I will say that, having now read a Stephen King novel, I am at the point where I'm like, well, actually, yes, they're long, but his writing is digestible enough that I didn't find that the length felt as much as I thought it would, or that I maybe find with the average novel of that sort of length. So I'm not opposed potentially to looking out at some other Stephen King books, even just on my own.
It's difficult to say which ones I should recommend to you because Hearts in Atlantis is just a wonderful book.
Yeah.
Bag of Bones is, in my opinion, the scariest Stephen King book that I've read so far. I had to read it all in one sitting, and I'm looking at it on my bookshelf, and it is as thick as The Stand. It took me, like, almost an entire 24-hour period to read that book.
Hmm.
I didn't do anything other than sometimes get up to grab, like, a glass of water, but I was so terrified I couldn't go to bed,
Yeah.
and I was in my 20s. So
Yeah. So I may very well. I'm still intimidated by the length of like the stand and stuff. Certainly.
yeah, I mean, there's definitely some merit to, the classics like It and The Stand. I so it's hard for me to tell you which ones to read. But we're creeping on an hour and a half,
Yeah.
and while I feel like I could talk about this more, I am gonna slide us along to the rating. Just how many out of 5 giant peaches would you rate this book?
Hmm. I mean, I knew this question was coming, and I still don't have a great. I also just don't remember what I've been rating things. So now I'm like
Yeah.
sitting here like, am I going to start getting really inconsistent? Um, I don't know. I think I'm at like a 3.5, maybe. I
Oh,
I enjoyed it. By and large, I enjoyed it more often than I didn't.
you're so generous.
Yeah, I don't know.
I had so many gripes with it that I was sitting here thinking like, "Is a 1 too high?" I'm gonna go with 1.5 because I know how much better Stephen King can be. I know how much scarier Stephen King can be, and there was so much nonsense that I I just didn't feel like lent itself to the horror.
Yeah,
And also, I found the sex scenes in this book incredibly cringy.
I
He can do better.
to be honest, forgot there were sex scenes until you just said it.
There it was he can do better.
Yeah, I mean, my rating may be somewhat influenced by the fact that I was expecting this book to be a chore.
Mm,
Just like I said, because of the reasons that I had conjured over the course of my life for just never reading a Stephen King book, besides on writing. And so I might be forgiving of it because it already had the deck stacked against it to a certain degree
that's
when
fair.
I began, because I was expecting it to just be kind of the slog to get through.
It has the deck stacked against it, like, the other way for me in that I've read so much other way better Stephen King that I'm judging it against that instead of just in a general sense.
Yeah.
But, fear not, dear listeners. We will lay off the multiple 100-page long books for just a little while. Um, my next pick will be very gentle. What is your next pick, Brandon?
Well, since over the course of this episode, we buried the podcast in the pet cemetery at the beginning. You see, and while we were talking, it came back, so it's back. This is not our last episode.
But it came back weird.
It came back weird, which means that we are going to read Animorphs #1. The Invasion is the name of that one by KA Applegate. Uh, One of my major childhood influences is that series. I loved that series a lot, and I devoured them as quickly as I could.
I'm really excited about this because my very good friend Nick, thank you so much, Nick, dropped off a cardboard box with every Animorphs book in it for me. I have to give them back eventually, but I'm ready for this.
Yeah. And the nice thing is that having physical copies, you can like enjoy the flip book action.
Flip book
Hmm.
action? Oh, what?
Anyhow, uh, the music used in this podcast was licensed by Epidemic Sound. Transcripts were generated by Otter.ai.
Do you have a question or a comment for the team? I don't know why I say the team. It's just two of us.
Routine.
We're okay. We're a team. Hey, teammate. Well, regardless, you can find us on Twitter at Dog Ate My Book Pod and on Instagram at My Dog Ate My Book Report, or by emailing us at dogatemybookraport@gmail.com. We would be super excited to know what books you loved growing up, or if you want to yell at me about my thoughts on Stephen King.
Yeah, definitely tell us what books you loved growing up that you should not have been allowed to read.
Yes. Make me feel like I'm not alone in being
Yeah,
potentially damaged
yeah.
by reading these books.
Or if you also think slapping the dummy is the scariest thing in the world, let us know that too,
Uh,
because that will make me feel not alone.